Hello, I am Austin Platts, and I have put together a presentation on why I think we are entering a recession. Today is July 16th, 2024, and the name of this presentation is Hard Landing. You've probably heard soft landing a ton of in the news. Soft landing basically means that they avoided the recession. Hard landing means it's going to be kind of brutal. So I'm breaking this out into 11 different parts because it would be way too long if I put it all in one. So this is the first video of the 11, and it is the business cycle. And you have to understand the business cycle to understand why we're entering a recession. And then in the next 7 videos, I will basically show you the business cycle in real time and how it has played out in our economy today. And I'm going to show you this with a lot of charts and a lot of proof, actual data to show you why I think that we are entering a recession. I'm also going to end it with a video on the stock market. The stock market is different from the business cycle, but they kind of rhyme. And I'm going to show my thoughts on the stock market and what I expect to happen. I'm going to talk about some catalysts that might really speed up the process of the recession incoming. And then I'm going to talk about how to prepare for the recession and what you can do to hedge against it. So, first video, the business cycle. So what is the business cycle? It doesn't actually have anything really to do much with businesses. It's really the debt cycle. And the business cycle specifically is the short-term debt cycle, okay? Because you have a long-term debt cycle, you have a short-term debt cycle. And that's shown in this chart. In the y-axis, you have GDP, and on the x-axis, you have time. And over time, GDP generally goes up. And this is due to, rising population, more people in the workforce, the economy becoming more efficient, being able to produce things easier, faster. And this is essentially the economy without borrowing. And it's borrowing that causes these huge cycles. So this long one is the long-term debt cycle, and this is 75 to 100 years typically. And these short ones are the business cycle. And every time you drop here, it's a recession. Boom, recession, boom, recession. But you generally tend to increase either way. And these are about every 5 to 8 years. But as you can see, you eventually have to go back down and then rise again. Okay, so these are inevitable. It's just how the economy works. And we're going to go into how this happens. So first, you need to understand this really important equation. This is the spending equation, and this is how the whole economy works. Okay, so if you think about the price of an item, the price would be the amount you spent divided by the quantity of goods. So if you just put the quantity on the other side, this is your spending equation, and the quantity of goods is really the goods and services. I just abbreviated it. But think of this as the actual productivity of the economy, and this is what it actually produces. This is how well it produces goods and services. And then on the left, this shows how much people are willing to spend for those goods and services. So you can show this equation and through different equations. The second one is just expanding out spending. So what is spending? Well, you can spend with money, you can spend with credit. And when you hear credit, just think borrowing. And like I said earlier, the quantity of goods is kind of the productivity of the economy. And this is also referred to as nominal GDP equals prices times real GDP. Real GDP is the the quantity of goods produced. And then if you think about this in terms of supply and demand, I put this asterisk here because this isn't actually an equation, but it's just an easy way to look at the equation, is that the spending side of the equation is really the demand side. It's the consumer demanding products. It's what they will spend. And then the quantity is the supply. It's the supply of goods that businesses are producing. And if you think about this, it makes sense, because if the demand for an item increased a lot, but the supply stayed the same, they can increase their prices. And it goes on in reverse, is if the demand drops, they might drop their prices to get people to buy it. And then if you have a low supply of something, it becomes very rare, but the demand stays the same, you can increase the price. So these equations are also written out in terms of the change of them, which I show here. And there's a phenomenon in algebra where the change in the product of two variables is the change of one plus the change in the other. I'm not going to go into the derivation of that, but just trust me on this. And this only works when the change is a percentage change. So every time you see a delta, just think percentage change. So the percentage change in spending, or the percentage change in the money and the credit, is the percentage change in the prices plus the percentage change in the productivity, the quantity of the goods. And spending is driven by money and credit, but credit mainly. Okay, like 95% of all the money out there is actually credit. It's borrowed money that didn't actually exist before. So where does credit come from? I'm going to have to kind of explain the monetary system to you briefly, but just bear with me, because the whole economy is driven on credit. So what is monetary policy and what is fiscal policy? I'm just going to run through this real quick. Monetary policy is the Federal Reserve, and fiscal policy is the U.S. Treasury. And the Federal Reserve has Jerome Powell as the chairman on the left, and the Treasury has Janet Yellen as their the head. And the Federal Reserve has three goals, and it's to maintain maximum employment, so make sure everybody's kind of got a job, have stable prices, so make sure inflation doesn't get awry, and to have moderate long-term interest rates. We'll get into that later. And fiscal policy is just spending and taxation to influence the economy. Okay, when you think of these two, just think of Federal Reserve prints the money and controls the interest rates, and the Treasury borrows the money and then spends it. So Federal Reserve prints, U.S. Treasury borrows. They're different entities, though. Okay. They work together hand in hand, even though they say they don't, but they're technically different. So I'm going to add one more equation to you, this last one I promise, is that the debt that you have to repay is the credit, so the money that you borrowed plus interest, okay? So the interest that people demand on the money they loan out is always different, but essentially there's a risk premium, there's a default premium. They got to add on a little bit to make money, and it depends on the duration. If you loan your money out for 30 years, you're going to add more interest because there's more risks for you. So that's an important equation. And let's talk about where credit comes from. So I know this is a lot at first, but I'm going to explain this whole thing to you. So let's start down here with private banks. And when I say private banks, I basically mean all banks out there besides the Federal Reserve. And the banks give out loans to businesses and people. And when they do that, they actually create money. They print money. And I know this sounds crazy, but it's true. They create money out of thin air and add money to the money supply, the broad money supply. So that's one way that credit can increase, is the private banks give loans, and the businesses and the people borrow. So credit, borrow. So that's the private side. Let's talk about the fiscal side, kind of the government side, is that the Treasury taxes businesses and people. Okay, so they take money in, that's their income, and then they spend it. They spend it on Social Security. We'll skip interest for now. They spend it on health, national defense, Medicare, Social Security, transportation, etc. They spend a ton of money. Okay, and as of late especially, they've had a deficit, so they spend more than they take in. Now, that wouldn't typically work for us, but it can work for the government because what they do is they borrow from different people and they issue these IOUs called treasuries. So we, business and people or foreign nations, private banks, we loan our money to the government and they give us this IOU saying, I'll pay you back one day with interest. Now, the Federal Reserve can also lend to the Treasury through a process called quantitative easing. And essentially what that is briefly is they are buying long-term securities from banks and giving them money, and then they're taking that money and buying the treasuries. So they kind of go through the bank to buy the treasuries, and when they do that, they print money out of thin air. So that's the money printing. And so they borrow money, they print money. And one reason they may do this is because if the government wants to spend a ton of money, kind of like what they did in 2020, and they issue these treasuries, but not enough people want to buy the treasuries, then the interest rate will go up because people will demand a higher interest rate to buy the treasuries. There's such a high supply of them that everybody's like, oh, I don't want it, but if you're going to issue it, like I'll buy it with a higher interest rate. So they don't want to have to pay a high interest rate on these IOUs. So what the Federal Reserve will do is they'll just buy it for them to keep the interest rate down. Now, the treasuries that they issue, usually called treasury bonds, is basically just a running tally of the U.S. debt. And it's 34 trillion right now. So the amount of treasuries they've issued or owe right now is the U.S. debt at 34 trillion. And you might say, okay, well, how do they pay them back in the future when they owe the treasury, when the duration ends? They just issue more treasuries. It's crazy. And that's the net interest that they have to pay to the public. So it's crazy. That's why when you hear, the interest rates getting crazy, that's just the government issuing more IOUs to pay the interest on the IOUs they paid previously. So that's basically the summary of the monetary system. This is private money creation, and this is fiscal money creation. But this is really where the credit's created. And you could also argue that the foreign nations bring in money into our country because it started in one country and came to the U.S., but foreign nations aren't buying as much as they used to. Okay, so that is the monetary system. Now you know where credit comes from. So now let's talk about the business cycle. Okay, the business cycle happens because of borrowing, because of credit. It's all about credit. And let's look at this. So when interest rates are low, okay, then people will borrow more. Okay, credit goes up, interest rates go down. And people will borrow more because money is easy to get. Okay, you heard easy money. It's because it'd be like us saying, okay, yeah, I'll borrow $1 million if my interest payment's only 0.1%. It's like I'll figure out how to pay that 0.1%, and now I can use all this money. So when money's easy, credit increases. And when credit increases, it allows people to borrow money that they don't have and spend it into the economy. So I have a slide. This allows us to consume more than we produce. Okay, so if GDP stays the same, but we're spending more, it creates this divergence. Okay, and this really isn't more innovation as it's shown. It's more credit in the economy, and this will just keep going and going and going. And as you can see, money plus credit equals prices plus productivity. So if credit increases, but productivity stays the same, the prices go up. So that's why you get inflation. When the economy's booming, they say, credit's easy, people are taking on bigger risks because why not? Money's easy. Then inflation happens. It's called overheating. And eventually this has to straighten back out because think about it. Not every single investment people make is going to be a good one. So say you borrow money not all of those investments are going to pan out. So what happens is the banks start to realize this, and then they start to request higher interest rates. They say, okay, yeah, like this guy failed on his repayment. So if you want a loan, it'll have to be at a higher interest rate. I got to get paid a higher premium. So the interest rates will start to rise. And as interest rates rise, credit goes down. And as credit goes down, prices go down, and basically it causes this feedback loop of where money gets hard to come by, and people default. So if Joe defaults on Mark and Mark owed Tim, then Tim's not getting his money because none of them have the money. It disappeared from the bad investments. So essentially, that's what happens, and this is right here is the recession. It's the cleansing of the economy because it got overheated and so blown out of proportions, allowing people to consume more than they actually have. And here's your recession. It's the cleansing. If you're going to borrow money, you have to pay it back eventually. Okay? If you're going to consume more than you produce, you're going to have to consume less than you produce later. Okay? And that's the business cycle. And as you can see, borrowing money doesn't increase the GDP in the long run. It doesn't go like this. It cleanses so hard typically that you just go back up to where you were in the regular slope. So that's the business cycle. And I want to talk about the treasuries that the government issues. They issue different durations, okay? So we could loan our money to the government for 30 years, or we can loan it to them for 3 months, okay? From 10 years to 30 years are bonds, or anything greater than 10 years. I think it's over 1 year to 10 year are notes, and 1 month to 1 year are T-bills. And this makes sense because if I'm going to loan my money to the government, I'm going to expect a higher interest rate if it's for 30 years than I would if it's for 6 months. Okay, so this is a normal looking yield curve, they call it. And the Fed funds rate is the overnight rate that banks can lend to each other. Okay, and this is the shortest duration loan. And this right here, the Fed funds rate, is what the Federal Reserve controls. So they can print money and they also control this exact rate. And that's just one way they try to basically stop the economy from overheating, is that when it's booming, getting ridiculous, prices start increasing, they'll raise the interest rates. And as they raise it, credit becomes harder to get, and it'll slow the economy and go down. And as it goes down, the recession will be so hard that they'll lower the rates, typically right before the recession gets bad. And they lower the rates to try to stimulate the economy again and try to get it going. In my opinion, they're a lot better at slowing the economy down with higher interest rates, and they're not as good at stimulating it again by interest rates going down, because in a recession, no one's taking out loans. I mean, people don't have jobs. They're just trying to pay their bills. They're not taking out loans. So that's why a lot of the times you'll see them lower the rates a lot, and then they'll start just giving money out. They'll print the money and give money out to stimulate the economy. And that's basically what happens. And in a recession, you get an unemployment because as money becomes hard to come by, businesses have to let people go to maintain their margins or to even stay afloat. And that's kind of the feedback loop I was talking about. It just feeds on each other and gets worse and worse, and eventually starts to recover. And this is just a way that the Federal Reserve kind of manipulates the market, is they control that short-term interest rate as opposed to allowing the free market to kind of decide what it is themselves. So that's business cycle. And where are we in this cycle right now? I think we're right here in that red circle. I just want to mention this is not the stock market, okay? This is different than the stock market. They do rhyme, like I said, but this is different because, as you'll see, the stock market, all asset prices are actually at the very peak, or at least rising towards the peak. And I believe we're right here. I believe we're right before the recession, really starts to come on full force. And in the next 7 videos, I'm going to show you exactly why. I'm going to show you proof of how we got here and what it's going to look like and how to hedge and prepare for this, because this is where we're at and this is healthy. And I want to talk about recessions for a second. What is technically a recession defined as? Well, it's a significant, widespread, and prolonged downturn in economic activity. And a common rule of thumb is that it's 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP. So like I said before, GDP kind of typically always goes up at a slow pace. But during a recession, while the economy gets cleansed, gets rid of all the bad investments, gets rid of the businesses, it actually, the GDP goes negative for 2 quarters at least. And when we think about recessions, a lot of times people think about the great financial crisis in 2007, 2008, 2009. And that was, what is that, 15, 17 months. Some people felt the pain longer. But when you look at the average recession, it's just a little over a year. And that great financial crisis was the longest recession we've had since the Great Depression in 1929, the early 30s. Which was bad, over 3.5 years, and then it came again in the late 30s. But I mean, look at the dot-com bubble in 2001. That was less than a year. The one in 1990 was less than a year. So I'm not saying that this recession isn't going to be as bad as the previous one, but and this also actually doesn't include the COVID recession, which was really short. But recessions are good for the economy. Even though a lot of people, lose their job and it's tough, it has to happen. Okay, these bubbles have to pop. It has to cleanse, and it's bound to happen. And the longer it's delayed, the longer it's pushed out, the more manipulated the economy gets, by fiscal policy and monetary policy, the worse the cleansing gets. Okay, and I think that's kind of what's happened is they keep trying to push it. And eventually it's got to pop. So that's the business cycle. In the next video, I'll talk about inflation, what caused the massive inflation that we saw in the last few years, where inflation's at now, and what that means in terms of the future months going ahead. I'll see you in the next one. Godspeed.